So there is this exhortation that's become ubiquitous at conferences and business meetings like this. Think outside the box. I've really come to dislike this because it's kind of become the new box inside of which everybody thinks. You know? It pays lip service to the notion of transformation without people really understanding just how radical a shift in paradigm actually is. And you can't possibly think outside of the box unless you know what the box is inside of which you're actually thinking. So I wanted to spend our time here today meditating on the nature of the box inside of which we are constrained to create social change. So my career in this arena began when I was a freshman at Harvard. There's a joke about people who went to Harvard. How do you know if someone went to Harvard? They usually tell you within the first 60 seconds of meeting them. And so I chaired the Harvard Hunger Action Committee. I was 19 years old at the time. And for the first time, I was learning about the massive mortality associated with hunger and hunger-related disease. And as I was learning about just how massive this problem was, I became very frustrated with the puny nature of these little fundraisers we were doing up against the massive scale of this social problem. And I wanted to do something big, but I didn't have any big ideas. And then the summer before my senior year, I heard about these two guys who were bicycling across America to raise money for cancer research. And it totally took my breath away. I realized that I hadn't been thinking big enough, that I had been thinking inside a little box myself. And I said, that's what I want to do. I want to do a cross-country bike ride with a whole bunch of students for the cause of world hunger. And so that next fall, my co-chair and I went back to school, and for 13 nights we sat methodically at each of the 13 dining halls at Harvard, and we asked every single student who walked by, hey, will you bicycle across America with us next summer to fight world hunger? And everybody said no. Was the gist of it, except for 38 people. So that next summer, 39 of us flew to Seattle, and we spent the next 9.5 weeks bicycling 4,256 miles across the continental United States. And we raised about 80 grand for Oxfam, which was wonderful. But the more important thing was when we arrived into Cambridge at the end of this journey, we felt depleted, spent, totally exhausted, like we had given the most we could possibly give for a cause that we cared about deeply, and more than that we could not have done. And that was a feeling that I had been very hungry for, that at least one point in my life, doing something that exhausted the full measure of my potential. And so, a few years later, I moved to Los Angeles, and it was the early 90s. It was the height of the AIDS epidemic. It was before protease inhibitors had been developed. And, as many of you probably recall, it was an absolutely horrible time, and a friend would tell you he was HIV positive, and, 6 weeks later, he'd be dead. And there was nothing big you could do about it. You could go buy a ticket to a gala AIDS charity dinner. That was not what you wanted to do. You didn't want to sit and eat Caesar salad, while you were burying your friends. And so I recalled the power of that cross-country bike ride and realized that the AIDS community really needs something like that. It needs some powerful vehicle for the expression of all this anger and all of this grief and all of this compassion. And so we created this event. It was a 7-day bike ride from San Francisco to Los Angeles called California AIDS Ride. And you had to go the whole 7 days. You had to go the whole 600 miles. You had to sleep in a tent overnight. and you had to raise a minimum of $2,000 for the privilege. And that was different because up until then, these thon events had welcomed people with open arms, no matter how much or how little they had raised, which was wonderfully democratic, but it wasn't a very powerful revenue model. And we didn't market the event to athletes or to cyclists. We marketed it to average people who had it in them to do something extraordinary. So when I tell you we had the most motley crew of people pedaling their bikes from San Francisco to Los Angeles, you know, the widest rear ends, dressed in outfits that did not look like Lance Armstrong, you know? But that's what made it so beautiful, you know, to see some 68-year-old woman who lost her son to AIDS, terrified of riding a bike from San Francisco to Los Angeles, but there was absolutely nothing that was going to stop her. And so that first event was very successful. We had 478 people ride. We netted $1,013,000, which was a lot more than we thought we were going to net. And so we began expanding the age rides all over the United States, and we did them from, well, we did them across Alaska, across Montana, from Boston to New York, the Twin Cities to Chicago, Austin to Dallas, Washington to Philadelphia. And in the midst of that, looked at the issue of breast cancer, which had very similar dynamics, where people were losing their dearest loved ones, their mothers, their wives, their daughters, and there was nothing big you could do but, you know, buy a pink ribbon mug or buy, you know, Kellogg's pink cereal in October. And so we asked, why are walkathons always 10 kilometers long? Is that a rule? That you can't have a walkathon unless it's 10 kilometers long. You know, there's another box, right? So let's break out of that thinking. And we created this 60-mile long walk, 3 days from Santa Barbara to Malibu. And you had to go the whole 3 days. You had to go the whole 60 miles. You had to raise, I think it was $1,500 in order to do it. And that event was a great success. It netted $4 million. And so we began expanding those all over the United States. And then we began doing events for suicide prevention and other issues. Over the course of 9 years, we had 182,000 people ride or walk in one of these events. They raised a total of $582 million. And in the last year that we produced the events, 2002, the events netted, after all expenses, $81 million, which is the equivalent of about half of the annual giving of the Rockefeller Foundation. We were a for-profit company. We had 400 full-time employees in 16 U.S. offices. We simply charged a fixed, flat production fee for each event that we did. We didn't do any commission-based or any percentage-based fundraising. This was our headquarters in Los Angeles that was made entirely out of shipping containers and raw lumber. The management offices were actually in shipping containers, so if you had an executive that wasn't working out, you just pull a forklift up to the container, and before they knew what had hit them, it was all over. This is a 30-second commercial that we used to show on the events that'll give you an idea of the emotional sensibility of these things.
Dear Mom, having a great time. I was kind of scared, 60 miles in 3 days, sleeping in a tent. But I feel like I'm being carried along on this great big wave of kindness. And they told us this morning no group this small ever raised this much money to fight breast cancer. 2,000 of us. And we raised $7 million. Wish you were here, Mom. I really wish you were here.
So producing these events for 9 years gave us a really unique perspective on the way the donating public thinks about charity at every level. And it was from that perspective that the ideas in this book that I wrote came. The book is called Uncharitable. It's from Tufts University Press. And the book is about transforming the way the donating public thinks about charity. It's about changing virtually everything we've been taught, because I think most of what we've been taught is upside down, it's backwards, it's really dysfunctional, and it's standing in the way of progress. So it's about radical things like getting people to stop asking this question, what percentage of my donation goes to the cause versus overhead? And I'll explain why in a moment. And it's about giving nonprofit organizations enormously greater freedom to spend money on the things we typically demonize as overhead, so that they can raise enormously greater sums of money and have some hope of achieving some fraction of the scale of these massive problems they're chartered to confront. Because that's really what it's all about, isn't it? So I want to just begin by looking at some big social statistics. In 1992, UNAIDS estimated 1.1 million adults and children died of AIDS in the world. Almost 20 years later, despite the introduction of protease inhibitors, that number was higher, at 1.8 million adults and children dying of AIDS every year in the world. In 1991, 43,000 American women died of breast cancer. Almost 20 years later, that number hadn't changed very much. In 2009, about 40,000 American women died of breast cancer. In 1992, the UN estimated 824 million people malnourished in the world. 10 years later, that number hadn't changed very much. And in 2009, the UN estimated 1 billion people malnourished in the world. Poverty has remained stuck at about 12% of the US population ever since we started measuring it. Now you could say, some of these numbers are actually getting better as a percentage of the population, but no one could argue that these numbers are approaching anything remotely close to what we had dreamed. This is not the kind of progress we had hoped for when we got into this work, and it's certainly not the kind of progress we hope for over the course of the next 20 years. So the question that I've tried to ask is this whole system and the whole way we think about social change, is it capable of achieving Apollo-like aspirations on a timeline that dignifies the value of a human life? So perhaps, a cure for breast cancer, not 40 years from now or 50 years from now or whenever it might happen to happen, but on a definitive, breathtaking, impossible timeline, 7 years from now or 10 years from now. And if this system isn't capable of that, why isn't it? And what kind of a system might be? So my observation is that we have two rule books. We have one for charity, and we have one for the rest of the economic world. We blame capitalism for creating these huge inequities in our society, presumably because capitalism is a very powerful thing. It would have to be to create huge inequities. And then we refuse to allow the nonprofit sector to actually use the tools of the free market and capitalism to rectify those inequities. So I want to look at the way that this separate rule book discriminates against the nonprofit sector in 5 different areas. The first being compensation. So in the for-profit sector, we allow the payment of a competitive wage based on the value that people produce, really without limit, as long as they continue to produce value. But we don't like to see people make a lot of money in charity. We have a visceral reaction to the notion that anyone would make very much money helping other people. It's interesting that we don't have a visceral reaction to the notion that people would make a lot of money not helping other people. Or that people would make a lot of money hurting other people. We think of this as our value system, right? This is our system of ethics. We hold it sacred. What we don't realize is that this value system has a very powerful side effect, which is it gives really stark, mutually exclusive choices between either doing well for yourself or doing good for the world to the brightest kids coming out of our best universities and business schools and law schools, and sends tens of thousands of people marching every year, people who could make a huge difference in social change, directly into the for-profit sector because they're simply unwilling to make the kind of lifelong economic sacrifice that the nonprofit ethic requires of them. And if it isn't the kids themselves, it's their parents. What do you mean? I just spent $250,000 sending you to college and you're going to go work in the nonprofit sector? Business Week did a survey in 2002 that they haven't repeated, and they looked at the compensation packages for MBAs 10 years out of business school. So these kids graduated at an average age of 28, so 10 years later they were 38 years old. And the median compensation package for a Stanford MBA 10 years out of business school, 38 years old, then was $400,000. Meanwhile, the average salary for the CEO of a $5 million plus medical charity in the US was $232,000, and the average salary for the CEO of a hunger charity in the US was $84,000. Now, there's no way you're going to get a lot of people with $400,000 annual earning capability to make a $316,000 annual sacrifice to become the CEO of a hunger charity. Now, some people will say, well, it's just because those MBA types are greedy. Maybe not. Maybe they're smart. Think about it this way. It's literally cheaper for that person to donate $100,000 a year to the hunger charity, right? Get a $50,000 state and federal tax deduction, so still be something like $260,000 a year ahead of the game. Now be called a philanthropist, right? Now sit on the board of the hunger charity, indeed probably supervise the poor SOB who decided to become the CEO of the hunger charity, and have a lifetime of this kind of earning potential and gratification still ahead of them. Some people said, look, it's just not right, it just shouldn't be. People should accept lower wages in the nonprofit sector because they're helping others and there's psychic benefit associated with that. To which I say, look, there's a hell of a lot of psychic benefit associated with making $400,000 a year and being able to donate $100,000 a year to charity, probably get your name put on the building of the charity, probably get honored at the annual dinner for the charity. The CEO's never going to get honored at the annual dinner for the charity. And when you say people should work for these kinds of wages in the nonprofit sector because of the psychic benefit, you're saying there is zero psychic benefit in the for-profit sector. Like the people at Apple, they ain't having any fun, you know, making iPhones and getting all their stock options, you know. They're not having any fun whatsoever. The people who make the Prius, they're miserable every single day. These are the salaries of the 5 highest paid executives at popular health charities in the US for 2009. So over here on the left is the Muscular Dystrophy Association, that's the American Lung Association, Komen for the Cure, Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and the American Cancer Society. And you can see they range from $373,000 up to $685,000. Now in the wrong context, those salaries can be made to sound absolutely scandalous. You can hear the evening news anchor saying, you thought your donations were going to find a cure for cancer. In reality, we have uncovered that they're going to pay the $500,000 pay packages of the honchos running the organization. And we get incensed with that coloring. But let's look at these salaries on a different scale, and let's compare them to the 5 highest paid executives at popular private health insurance companies. So those little slivers that you can't see anymore, those are the salaries we were just looking at. Health, we're still talking about health, like little kids with leukemia and, you know, senior citizens with Alzheimer's. The head of United Health was paid $6.5 million, all the way on up to Aetna, $38.1 million. And this doesn't include any of the equity, any of the stock options. This is just, you know, cash, ordinary income compensation. So the charity executives combined that year made a total of $2.4 million. The insurance executives made $71.8 million, or 30 times more. But these are the salaries we get all bent out of shape about. These are the salaries we cry immorality over. And that's why I say, you know, it's an upside down world that values the management the affordability, the institutionalization of disease 30 times greater than its eradication, which is what the charities are supposed to be up to. And it's not just because it's the nonprofit sector. The head football coach at USC in 2009, that same year, made $4.4 million. The head of the nonprofit New York Philharmonic in 2007, $2.2 million for a 16-week stint. Each of the 20 highest paid college football coaches at nonprofit universities in the United States in 2009 made at least $2 million that year. So we're fine paying high salaries to entertain high society, but the moment the image of a needy child enters the picture, our logic falls apart, and we look at it as a zero-sum game in which any money paid to the leader is money that was wrenched from the hands of those children, rather than looking at it as an investment that potentially dramatically enlarges the amount of money available for those kids. The second area of discrimination is advertising and marketing. So here again, the for-profit sector gets every advantage. Spend, spend, spend on advertising until the last dollar no longer produces a penny of value. But we don't like to see our donations spent on advertising and charity. You know, our attitude is, look, if you can get the ad donated, I'm okay with that, but I don't want my donations spent on advertising. I want it to go to the needy. Again, as if the money spent on advertising couldn't dramatically enlarge the amount of money available for the needy. That $581 million we raised for AIDS and breast cancer, it was all driven by paid media, you know, full-page ads in the New York Times, primetime television, primetime radio, and but for that advertising spending, we would have raised a big, fat zero, because nobody would have known what we're doing. Imagine if we told Apple that the iPad, that iPhone 4S and Siri, wow, it's cool, you should advertise it. But only to the extent you can get the advertising donated at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, or on the last page of the sports section. In a liberal estimate for 2006, the nonprofit sector spent about $1.6 billion on $1.5 billion on marketing, the health and human services portion of the sector, versus $729 billion for the rest of the economy, or one message for a health and human services cause for every 479 messages for something else. Or if you want to look at it on a micro level, in 2009, Save the Children spent $3.3 million on advertising. Entertain the Children over here, also known as the Walt Disney Company, spent $2 billion on advertising. Or compare cancer and cosmetics. You know, the big Susan G. Komen Foundation, $18 million spent on advertising. L'Oreal, $1.8 billion spent on advertising. Or compare candy and malnutrition. Feeding America in 2009, $1.7 million spent on advertising. The Mars Candy Company, $514 million spent on advertising. These numbers are important in light of this statistic. Charitable giving has remained constant at about 2% of GDP in the US ever since we started measuring it in the 70s. The fact that it's been constant is important because it tells us that in 40 years, the nonprofit sector has not taken market share away from the for-profit sector. Now, how can one sector possibly take market share away from another sector if it isn't really allowed to market? The famous Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith, you know, his big thesis was that the for-profit sector creates wants, it creates desires that you didn't know you had. At first it creates the product, and then through the massive engines of advertising and marketing, it creates the market for that product, it creates the demand for that product. It would be considered malfeasance in the for-profit sector to launch a new product without an adequate advertising budget to build the market for that product. But we are supposed to build markets for the end of hunger and disease and everything else without actually investing any money in building that market. The third area of discrimination is risk-taking, and specifically in pursuit of new donors, new customers. So here again, the for-profit sector gets every advantage. Paramount Pictures can make a $150 million movie that flops, And no one calls the Attorney General, right? It's all considered part of their business model. They make a lot of movies. Some of them succeed, some of them fail, more succeed than fail, and on that basis, they build these large enterprises. But I can tell you from personal experience, and I'm sure some of you have had it, you do a puny, in comparison, little $5 million community fundraiser, and it doesn't produce a 70% return to the cause in the first 12 months, and your character's called into question. So the nonprofit sector is petrified of attempting any bold, brave, high-profile, risky new community fundraising ideas for fear that if the thing fails, that will be the end of them. Meanwhile, every week in Hollywood, they're placing $150 million, $200 million bets on the most ridiculous, Sex and the City 19 kind of movies, I mean, there has never been a fundraising idea funded to the tune of $150 million, a risk taken at that level, ever in the history of the nonprofit sector. Meanwhile, Hollywood does it every week. The fourth area of discrimination is time horizon. So Amazon, for example, went for 6 years without returning any profit to investors because the investors had patience. They knew that there was a big goal down the line called building market dominance, so we'll be patient. But if a nonprofit organization ever had a huge dream that required that for 6 years no money's going to go to the needy because we're going to spend all that time building scale, we would expect a crucifixion. And the last area of discrimination is profit itself. So the for-profit sector can pay people money in order to attract their capital. The nonprofit sector, by definition, cannot. So the for-profit sector monopolizes the multi-trillion-dollar capital markets, and the nonprofit sector really has the donation as its only financial instrument. So it's starved for risk capital and for growth capital. So if you put these 5 things together, you can't use money to lure talent away from the for-profit sector. You can't spend anywhere near the amount of money the for-profit sector does on advertising to get new customers. You can't take the kinds of risks in pursuit of those customers that the for-profit sector can. You don't have the same amount of time to produce results that the for-profit sector does, and you don't have a stock market. Well, you just put the nonprofit sector at the most unspeakably extreme disadvantage to the for-profit sector on every level. And then we call the whole system charity, as if there's something really sweet about it, I mean, charity, real charity, grace, could not be undermined with more reverence paid to the notion of something noble. And if we have any doubt about the effects of these statistics, these separate rule books, this number is sobering. Since 1970, the number of nonprofit organizations that have crossed the $50 million annual revenue barrier is 144. The number of for-profits that have crossed it is 46,136. 90% of the nonprofit organizations in the United States have budgets less than $500,000. Only 1% have budgets greater than $10 million. So we're dealing with social problems, totally massive in scale, and our organizations can't develop any scale, any meaningful scale. All of the scale goes to Coca-Cola and to Burger King. So why do we think this way? I mean, we don't intend not to make a difference. Why would we have a system that works, that fundamentally obstructs us? Well, when I first wrote the book, I only had one sentence in there addressing this, and I had grown up in New England. I knew that Puritan mindset. This all just felt really Puritan to me, and so I said, these ideas come from old Puritan constructs. And my agent challenged me, and she said, how do you actually know that? And I sort of died inside, and I said, oh God, now I'm going to have to prove this. And I spent the next 6 months reading these narcolepsy-inducing books on the early Puritan settlers to New England. And I slept very well during this period. And the long and short of it was fascinating. The Puritans came to the New World for religious reasons, yes. But they also came here because they wanted to make a lot of money. They were very aggressive capitalists. They formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a corporation. They were accused of extreme forms of profit-making tendencies by the other colonists. John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts who wrote the famous sermon, Model of Christian Charity, all over his journal and his partners' journals are predictions about how much profit they would make in all of the trade that they were going to do in the New World. But at the same time, the Puritans were Calvinists. So they were taught literally to hate themselves. They were taught that self-interest was a raging sea that was a sure path to eternal damnation. Well, this created a real problem for these people, right? Here they come, they want to make all of this money. They're these aggressive capitalists. Making all this money will get you sent permanently, immediately, and directly to hell. What were they to do about this? Well, charity became their answer. It became this economic sanctuary where they could do penance for their profit-making tendencies. So, of course, how could you make money in charity if charity was your penance for making money? And they created these two economic worlds where there was really only ever one, and the merchants and the farmers and the carpenters of the world got free market practice, and the needy and all those who wanted to help them, who were mostly women, by the way, got this religion whereby everything that worked in the market was pretty much banished. And we're stuck with that system today, 400 years later. Self-deprivation has not been abandoned as the path to social change. It is pretty much the road still prescribed. Now, this separate rule book and this Puritan ideology, they get policed by this one very simplistic, very sinister, very dangerous question, which is, what percentage of my donation goes to the cause versus overhead? And we want the amount going to the cause to be very high and the amount going to overhead to be very low. Makes sense if you don't think about it for 30 seconds. But if you think about it for 30 seconds, the logic of it really begins to disintegrate. And never underestimate the ability of human beings to not think about things for 30 seconds. You know, I don't know, maybe half of you in this room are old enough to remember that there was a period, and it lasted for decades, when we walked around airports dragging the luggage before it dawned on us that we could put wheels on the suitcases. You know, there's this company, Samsonite. All they need to do is think about suitcases. It takes them 50 years to figure out wheel, suitcase. We could put these two things together. I was just thinking this morning, why do we call the places where we park driveways and the places where we drive parkways? You know? It's just, so anyway, if it took us that long to figure out wheels on suitcases, you can imagine how long it might take us to inquire into the difficulties with this question. Well, it turns out there are some big problems with this question. 3 categories of problems. The first is, it makes us think that overhead is not part of the cause. But it absolutely is, unless there's fraud going on. And if there's fraud going on, no one's going to report it in line item detail on their Form 990 so that everybody will know they're committing fraud. Then every dollar that a charity spends in good faith, it spends to advance the cause in the way it believes the cause can best be advanced. This idea that overhead somehow steals from the cause or is not an essential part of the cause creates this second, much bigger problem, which is it forces charities to go without the things they really need to solve problems in the interest of keeping overhead low. So, for example, maybe an organization wants to hire a powerful new leader who has an incredible vision for solving some social problem, but the person comes at a price, and the board looks at it and says, that's a lot of money, you know, that's going to really raise our overhead, and it's going to put us out of joint with the other charities that are our size. Let's go find someone for half the price who doesn't have a vision of how to solve the social problem in the interest of keeping overhead low. Or maybe an organization wants to double their fundraising staff in order to quadruple their fundraising revenues. But the board looks at it and says, you know, we're going to have to book all that expense this year. Our overhead's going to go up. We're going to lose our watchdog stars. Let's just keep the organization development the size that it is. So we're systematically forcing charities to obsess over keeping short-term overhead low at the expense of solving problems. We've built a whole market around it. Well, if what we tell charities is, look, all that really matters is that your overhead is low, and my willingness to donate to you depends on you keeping your overhead low, then what we're going to get is low overhead, or at least the appearance of it. If we don't ever say anything about, I want you to solve this social problem and I want you to solve it quickly, then that becomes a secondary matter. Which leads me off to a little tangent. You ready for a few pie charts? Can you handle some pie charts? We have this mistaken theory of social change. We have this mistaken theory of philanthropy and how to leverage your philanthropy. Our universe revolves around programs, right? And the idea is spend as little as possible on fundraising, under the logic that the less you spend on fundraising, the more money there is available for programs. Well, that makes sense if it's a zero-sum game. But if it's not a zero-sum game, then we have it backwards. And fundraising should be at the center of the universe, because fundraising is the one thing, the only thing that has the potential to multiply the dollars you donate into more money for programs. So I'm very excited about this. I did 3 new pie charts this morning. It's very rare for me to add new pie charts into this. So this is an experiment. So here's how we look at things. Here's how we look at overhead, right? This is a $10 million pie. 10% of it gets spent on overhead, or $1 million. That means 90%, or $9 million, is available for programs, for the cause. Here's what we think if we spend more money on overhead. Let's say we want to raise that overhead to 30%. Here's what we think happens. We think that now there's less money available for the cause, because now there's $3 million going into overhead and there's only $7 million available for the cause. But that's not, if the organization does it right, what actually happens. What actually happens, if you make that kind of investment in fundraising in particular, is the pie gets bigger. And the investment in overhead doubles the size of the pie to $20 million. So yes, your overhead is 30%. It's higher than 10%. But the amount of money available for programs now is no longer $9 million. The amount of money available for programs is $14 million. That's how it actually works. It's not a zero-sum game. You can make the pie bigger, and fundraising is the thing that makes the pie bigger. And if we want to solve some of these social problems, we had better start to make the pies bigger. I'll give you an example. The AIDS rides that I told you about. We launched the first California AIDS ride with a $50,000 investment. Within 8 years, we had turned that into $108 million net, a multiplication factor of 1,982 times the initial investment. We started the breast cancer 3 days with a $350,000 investment of risk capital. Within 5 years, we turned that $350,000 into $194 million. Net unrestricted money for breast cancer research, a multiplication factor of 554 times the initial investment. Now, if you're a philanthropist or you're a foundation really interested in breast cancer, what makes more sense? Go out and find the best breast cancer researcher in the world and give her $350,000 to do research, and essentially buy $350,000 worth of breast cancer research, or give that $350,000 to a carefully thought out fundraising plan at her organization and have that turn potentially into $194 million for breast cancer research, and then you get your money back. So there's a lot of talk these days in the nonprofit sector about this phrase capacity building. Let's start to invest in the infrastructure of organizations. Even that we have slightly wrong, because if you look at the categories of capacity building, there are things like finance and accounting, fundraising, human resources, leadership training, strategic planning, and technology. Only one of those things, fundraising, has the capability of multiplying the amount of money put into it. So investments in fundraising can not only multiply the amount of money available for programs, investment in fundraising can multiply the amount of money available for the other elements of capacity building. So fundraising actually builds capacity to build capacity. The third category of problem, to get back on our 1, 2, 3 track with this question about overhead percentages, is it gives donors really bad information, which is tragic because the only reason we use it is we think it's giving us good information. So first, it operates on a mistaken theory of waste. So a charity tells you 95 cents of your dollar goes to the cause, and you think, wow, that's great. I know that they don't waste any of my money, right? No, you don't. How do you know they're not wasting the 95% that they spend on the cause? That's where all the money's going. That's where the biggest opportunity for waste actually is. Related to that is it tells you nothing about the quality of the services they provide. So let's look at the crude example of 2 soup kitchens, A and B, right? And A tells you 10% of your donation goes to overhead, 90% goes to the cause. B tells you only 70% goes to the cause. Well, we've all been trained to think that A is by far the better soup kitchen. In fact, we kind of get angry at soup kitchen B. You know, how come you're spending 30% on overhead when soup kitchen A is able to do it at 10 cents on the dollar? But what if we actually went and visited those 2 soup kitchens and we found that soup kitchen A was serving rancid soup in a dilapidated facility with a really unfriendly staff? And Soup Kitchen B was in a state-of-the-art facility. They're serving hearty, nutritious soup. They have a super friendly staff. They're always open, and they do case management. Well, now it's clear you should have given your money to Soup Kitchen B. So the question, what percentage of my donation goes to the cause versus overhead, would have betrayed you utterly and completely in terms of determining which was the better institution to send your money to. The Better Business Bureau in 2002 did a survey asking the public, what do you think overhead should be? It's like asking the public how long they think thoracic surgery should take and then using that as a standard for thoracic surgeons. And what does the general public know about this? You know, and they asked people, what information do you most want before you give money to charity? And 79% of people said, I want to know how much of the money goes to programs. Only 6% said, I want to know if the money makes a difference. Now, why would that be? Well, we have managed to confuse the public into thinking that the two things are the same. We keep telling them that the charities with the low overhead are the good charities. You hear good, you think effective. So if you hear that the charity has low overhead, you don't think you need to know anything more because you think, well, they are effective. When in fact, you know, the nonprofit overhead cost study at Indiana University and Forces for Good and all of the other studies show no, the organizations that are investing in infrastructure are the better organizations. We don't do this with anything else in the economy. We don't, you know, for example, walk into a shoe store and say, bring me the shoes with the lowest overhead, please, you know. I don't need to see the shoes. I don't care to see the shoes. I just want the shoes with the lowest overhead. Or walk out of a shoe store with shoes full of holes and tell our friends you wouldn't believe how low the overhead was on these shoes, you know. But that's exactly how we treat charity. We buy on the basis of price and we don't ask anything about the quality of the programs. The third reason that this question gives donors bad information, and this is, I don't know, sort of the most evil among them, is it uses a mistaken theory of transparency. So some charity tells you, you know, 82 cents on the dollar goes to the cause. You think they're being transparent. In fact, the 82% may be obscuring what's actually going on. Because the percentage of your donation that goes to the cause depends entirely on how the charity defines the cause. And the more broadly they decide to define the cause, the higher the percentage they can tell you is going to the cause. So in the case of our 2 soup kitchens, what was going on was a little different than what we actually saw. Soup Kitchen A actually had a 20% fundraising cost and a 10% administrative cost, but when it came time to do their reporting, they said, hey, that 20% fundraising cost, we're talking about the cause all the time, so let's call it part of the cause, and we'll report that 90% of people's donations went to the cause. Soup Kitchen B had the identical expenses, but they didn't add the 20% to the cause. They added it to the overhead description. and they told people 70% went to the cause. So two identical sets of expenses, two completely different pictures of efficiency. And worse, Soup Kitchen A is serving rancid soup, doing questionable accounting, and they look much better on paper than Soup Kitchen B, which is serving hearty, nutritious soup and is doing conservative accounting. Now, does this actually happen in the real world? It happens on an epidemic scale. The nonprofit overhead cost study at Indiana University looked at the tax forms of 125,000 nonprofit organizations. That's a massive sample. It's like 10% of the sector. And they found that half of all the organizations and 1/3 of the organizations raising between $1 and $5 million were reporting 0% fundraising expense. Now, how do you raise $5 million a year and not spend a penny doing it? So if it's such a bad question, why do we ask it? Well, we've been trained to ask it. We're trained to ask it by the three watchdog agencies who keep getting talked about by the state's attorneys general, who keep getting referenced in the media, and then sadly, the charities themselves who keep telling you that the things the watchdog agencies tell you are the right things to ask about. So this is, as an example, the Attorney General of the state of Washington telling his constituents what question they should ask about charity.
The types of questions that you can ask?
Well, I always like to know how much of the money I'm donating is going to go to the end purpose as opposed to being sucked up by administration and overhead. And they should be able to tell you what percentage of the money you donate will be used for the right purpose and how much of it will be eaten up by administration and overhead.
Not a word to his constituents about, well, find out if the organization is actually doing any good in the world. Not a word about that. Here's a news program in Missouri. The woman on the street actually gives the right answer, but listen to what the news anchor says about it.
With more than 800,000 organizations, how do you choose where your hard-earned money goes?
You have to have trust in everyone that it's going to go to the right, who they say it's going to.
Wrong answer. Attorney General Jim Nixon and the Better Business Bureau warned consumers, don't donate to charities that eat up more than 35% of your money in administrative costs.
Even if they're trying to grow, even if they're actually trying to solve the social problem. And this is the head of Charity Navigator at Christmas in 2009.
We want to make sure that every single penny that you give, we want to help you to make sure that that giving is as effective as possible so that you can give the most you possibly can to the best charities that are out there. The best charities out there from our research have 75% or more of every dollar that you give going to program services, going to the cause that you care about, and 25% or less to fundraising and administrative overhead. That's the kind of charity you want to look for.
Here's the problem with Ken saying the most effective charities are the ones with the lowest overhead. At the same time on their website it said this, evaluating the effectiveness of a charity's programs is out of our scope. You know, now it's wildly expensive to measure program effectiveness and really elusive. It's very hard to do. But if you can't do it, don't be going out and telling the public that your research shows that you know which are the best charities. And then the charities reinforce all of this, right? So here's, oh yeah, Ken did say last year overhead ratios and executive salaries are useless for evaluating a nonprofit's impact, which is like hell freezing over. So we're making progress. Here's the American Heart Association. There's the Better Business Bureau seal of approval. Here's the Hunger Project. There are the 3 watchdog seals of approval. Here's Save the Children. There are the 3 watchdog seals of approval and the little pie chart showing you how little they spend on overhead. Here's Susan Komen for the Cure. There's the Charity Navigator, Better Business Bureau seal of approval. The worst thing about it is how tiny these watchdog organizations are. So between the 3 of them, they have a total of 28 staff. Next to nothing compared to the 10 million people employed in the nonprofit sector in America. Between the 3 of them, they have annual budget money of $3.3 million. Next to nothing compared to the $300 billion Americans donate to charity every year. So I keep saying someone should just buy them. Just buy them. And between them, they look at a total of 7,700 organizations, next to none compared to the, whatever it is, 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the US. So what we have in America as an infrastructure for helping the public to understand the value of the $300 billion given to charity every year is next to no one, spending next to nothing, looking at next to no organizations, and then teaching people to ask the wrong question. With the exception of Charity Navigator, which is now trying to look at questions of effectiveness, but their budget is woefully inadequate to do anything meaningful in that area. So what do we do about all of this? Well, as an initial matter, I think we need a national leadership organization. So several of us have come together and we're going to create something called the Charity Defense Council that will act as an anti-defamation league for the sector, because we don't have anything like that right now, that will author a national Civil Rights Act for charity, that will organize the sector around these issues, that will litigate statutes that are unconstitutional, and that will do a public-facing ad campaign the way the milk industry did. You know, the milk industry asked America, you got milk? You know, the pork industry's told America, we're not a fatty meat, we're the other white meat. You know, the egg industry said we're the incredible edible egg, we're not this thing that's going to give you heart attacks. The nonprofit sector has never come together to utter a word to the general public collectively about any of these things. So the first campaign we're going to launch is this campaign with people, and it says, I'm overhead. I'm overhead. I work on the cause 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I do the fundraising. Without me, there is no cause. Overhead is a good thing, and I'm overhead. To start to engage the public in some understanding of this. It's not the public's fault that they don't know. We don't ever tell them anything. So this ribbon you've been looking at is on the cover of the book, and I bought this piece of linen at a store in Los Angeles, and I ripped it apart by the threads, and I found this oil stain, and I ground it into the ground until it became this symbol for me of the desecration of our dreams on the altar of looking good, you know, and on the altar of conforming to ideas that came to be 400 years ago when people were terrified of going to hell. And I think ultimately we have to stand up for our truth. We have to get to know our truth again. You know, when you're gay, you have to stand up for your truth all the time. It's not like you just come out when you're 19 years old and great, now everybody knows I'm gay, that's done. You know, probably in the cab ride to the airport today, the guy will say, what's your wife think about the triplets? And I'll have to get into this exhaustive, transformative conversation about, I'm actually gay, and, you know, how's he going to feel about that, you know? But you just have to keep standing up for your truth. And the nonprofit sector has to begin to do that. Not just the staff, but donors as well. We have to begin to say that I'm sorry, but keeping low overhead is not my truth. That's not why I dedicated my life to this work. The lack of profit is not why I dedicated my life to this work. I dedicated my life to this work because I want to see some of these conditions change in my lifetime. And I want the freedom, and I will take the freedom to do whatever it is I need to do to solve those problems. This is the box. This is the box, and we need to get out of this box. Not only for ourselves, but for all of the people whose lives we work to improve. Because whether we know it or not, you know, they're in that box with us.